We are talking today with Mr. Keith Edmondson of Kalamazoo, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Now, Mr. Edmondson, can you start with some background on yourself? Let's begin with where and when you were born.
I was born in May of 1924 in Glen Ellyn, Illinois. I was actually born in Wheaton, that's where the hospital was, but I lived all my early years in Glen Ellyn, Illinois.
Okay, and what did your family do for a living?
My father was a tailor and had his own tailor shop in Chicago, so he would commute an hour each way, twice a day, and I didn't want to do that, obviously.
Okay. Well, how well did he do during the Depression? Because you're growing up in the 30s there.
Right, and he was unemployed for a year and a half, I think in the early 30s. I'm not sure. I was only 4 or 5 or 6.
Right.
The other important thing about my childhood is my grandfather Edmondson from Norway was living with us, and he'd been sailing the high seas for 30 years and didn't have anything to do except play with me, so he taught me how to tie all the knots and told me stories about sailing around Cape Horn, and it was kind of a very interesting childhood.
And how many kids were in the family?
I had a sister. I had, well, there were three children. My brother was 4 years older than I was, and he died fairly early on, I think when he was 5 or 6, so I was very young. And my sister was 6 years older, and then I think my mother lost a child in birth, so we didn't talk much about those things in those days.
Right. So basically you had basically an older sister that you grew up with then.
Right.
Okay.
And she resented me a little bit, as I remember it.
All right. Now, when did you graduate from high school?
1942, I was 18 years old. And then I went to Purdue University that fall in September.
All right. Now, do you remember how you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Yes, it was a Sunday. I was around, let's see, I think I was still at Purdue at that time.
If you graduated high school in 42.
Well, you're right. I'm a year off. It was a Sunday morning, and I was home, and I heard on the radio that it had been bombed. It didn't make a big impression on me at the time. Probably should have, but...
Now, before that, had you paid much attention to what was going on in the world in terms of the war in Europe and that kind of thing?
Well, I was a paper boy, and I used to read about the Finns fighting the Russians and holding them off in the Detroit and the Chicago Daily News, which I used to deliver. I wasn't too involved with the European war, and I'm not sure why. I was just busy doing other things, picking colleges and going to college and so forth.
So when Pearl Harbor happens, your first thought was not to go off and enlist in the military yourself?
No, quite the contrary. In fact, I remember being in a student group that the principal, Mr. Beester, was addressing, and he was telling us about the war in Europe and Pearl Harbor and so forth. And he was saying that he doubted very many people in the audience would serve in the service. Turns out he was quite wrong.
Did he think the war was going to be over quickly? Or?
I think so. I think he thought that once America got involved, it would be over quickly because of our industrial strength.
All right. Then, so instead of then going up and signing up, you just go ahead and you enroll in Purdue.
Right.
All right. And then how from there did you wind up in the military?
That fall, which would be about November 42, I heard about a program called the Aviation Cadet Program, which I looked into, and you had to take a test and all that kind of thing. But it sounded interesting because it deferred me until I finished college, and there I was a freshman, so it looked like a 4-year free ride. So I went down and took the test. I did really quite well on the test. In fact, they thought I must have cheated somehow. I didn't, but that all turned out, and so I was an aviation cadet from November 42 on.
Now, was the expectation then that they would eventually give you pilot training?
I really wasn't quite that interested in being a pilot. I'm not sure why. most of my colleagues in the Aviation Cadet Program were gung-ho for being pilots. But, you know, in I think February of '43, 4 months later, they changed their minds, and I was called into service at San Antonio, Texas. And I was, you know, I was an 18-year-old kid still, and it was kind of all a big adventure.
Yeah, how did they get you down to San Antonio?
By train. First I went to, I think it was someplace in Chicago, and boarded a train, and it took a long time to get there. We were all pretty dirty by the time we got there. The trains weren't very clean. But we adjusted to those things, and that's just the way it happened.
All right. Now, what kind of facility were you at down in San Antonio?
It was a barracks, it was an airfield barracks, and it was a classification center where you had to choose whether you wanted to be a pilot or a bombardier or a navigator or what. And I looked at the pilot training thing, and it was 14 months to become a pilot. And this sounds strange in retrospect, but it took 6 months to become a bombardier, and the pay difference wasn't huge, but it was enough to get me interested. So I chose being a bombardier, and a lot of the other bombardiers that I was with were washed out pilots, but I wasn't.
Okay. Now, now, did they give you some version of basic training when you first got there?
I think the classification center was really just deciding when and where. Well, we had physical PT training and things like that, but it was shortly after that I went to Ellington Field outside of Houston for free-flight bombardier training.
Okay, so they don't really keep you in San Antonio very long then?
No, and we never got into town because we were restricted to the base.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what did that first stage of pre-flight training consist of then, outside of Houston?
More physical training, in fact quite a lot. I remember we had to run a mile before breakfast and so forth. But it also involved some early book work. Some instructors were telling us about what the Air Force was like, what being an officer was like, and all the usual, not garbage, but not really important stuff as far as I was concerned. And it was shortly after that I think we were in pre-flight just a few weeks. We did get into Houston and so forth, but then I went to Midland, Texas for my bombardier training.
Okay. Now, what did that consist of?
Primarily operating the Norden bomb site. There was also some book work too, but operating the Norden bomb site on a trainer, which was arranged so that you had to coordinate the bomb site with the target and so forth. So it was manual manipulations, and then later on you got into flying at AT-11, I think, actually dropping practice bombs to see how good you were.
Okay. Now,
and that was pretty good.
Okay. Was that a twin-engine plane? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So when they're having you do practice runs for bombing, how does that work? Is there a big target on the ground, or?
You didn't actually drop anything, but you had an instructor with you, and there were two people on this trainer, and the trainer would maneuver in the hangar to a certain spot, and it was a question of how well you could coordinate and get the crosshairs on the target and hold them on the target so they wouldn't drift off, which was the purpose of the Norden bomb site. The instructor, of course, kept track of what you were doing and where the bomb would have dropped if you dropped the bomb, and so forth. And I found that really quite interesting. And I guess that's about all I really remember there. I was there until August of '43, and then I graduated, and so forth.
Yeah. Now, while you were at that stage of training, were they now letting you off the base so you could kind of get off and do other things?
We had pretty good access to Midland. was an interesting town because it's a lot of cattle raisers around there, and you sit there in town on the weekends and hear these stories about 4,000 of this and 4,000 of that, and it turns out they were talking about cattle. And so some of these people were really quite wealthy, and I got to know a few girls and so forth.
Okay. So then once you, now at that stage, had they actually taken you up in aircraft to actually try to drop anything yet? Or were just the practice?
No, we actually dropped, we had targets, with a target center and then rings around it, and we dropped practice bombs that were 100-pound bombs, but they only had sand in them.
Mm-hmm.
And they could see where the bombs dropped. And so we'd practice an initial point and a bomb run and drop the bomb and could see how well we did.
Okay. And how high up would you be when you were dropping things?
Oh, I'm not sure. I'd say probably 10,000 feet.
Okay.
It wasn't really way up there with oxygen and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
but it was pretty realistic practice.
Okay. And how effective was the bomb sight under those conditions?
You know, very good. I got most of my, this is maybe a little bit added to it, but I think I dropped most of my bombs within 50 feet of the target,
Mm-hmm.
which was considered quite good.
Right.
Good enough to become an instructor bombardier later on.
Right. Okay. So now you complete that stage of the bombardier training. You're kind of making it
Yeah.
fairly far on into 43 now. What's the next step for you?
Well, then I became part of the 4th Air Force out on the West Coast, and the first station was Mountain Home, Idaho, B-24s, and I was an instructor bombardier because I had done quite well in bombardier training, and that consisted of flying with air crews over targets and seeing how well the student bombardier, who was a bombardier, could do in dropping bombs on targets. And again, most of those were sand-filled bombs, but there were a few 100-pound real bombs that we dropped too.
Okay.
And then I was there probably a few months. There's not a whole lot of things to do in Mountain Home, Idaho. It's kind of out in the boonies. But then I moved down to Tonopah, Nevada, again with the 4th Air Force as an instructor bombardier. And that was really out in the boonies, and I was probably there for 3 or 4 months. Then you want the story about where I went after that?
Well, basically, were you satisfied with that, or did you want a different assignment?
That's hard to remember. Again, I'm still barely 19,
Mm-hmm.
and I found the work interesting, but the extracurricular activities were really pretty grim. In Tonopah, particularly, we were at 4,000 or 5,000 feet, I think, and the airfield runway took off up between 2 mountains, and we lost a lot of airplanes there in training, and I thought there must be a better place to be than this. So I started looking around.
Okay. So now, did you apply to transfer out or get into something else, or did they just tell you were going?
It's a very interesting story because a senior pilot, Major Benish, wanted to get a crew and go overseas. Now, why he wanted to do that, I'm not really sure, except I think that he was a senior career officer and wanted to have some overseas experience to put on his record and then get promotions and so forth. So he was forming a crew, and so he asked an instructor navigator to be part of the crew and asked me to become a bombardier. And some of the gunners were, particularly the engineer, was really a pretty senior guy for a new crew going overseas.
Mm-hmm.
So we all said yes. He was a pretty persuasive fellow and a nice guy and a good pilot. So I think it was a multitude of reasons that we ended up being on the crew going overseas, but I'm sure he was the one that was organizing all that.
Now, during your stint as a trainer there in Idaho and Nevada, were you younger than most of the other trainers?
I would think I was, because Well, I was still 18, so yeah, I guess so. I didn't check the ages of other people, though.
Because I think that to a large degree, when it came to going into officer training in the Air Corps, there was an expectation that you have to be a college graduate or have a certain amount of college and that kind of thing. They weren't usually taking just the new kids. But because of how your program worked, you may have just timed it right.
And, you know, in the fall of 42, there's some dire things happened around the world, and they really needed bodies, and they were greatly increasing the training of all kinds of Air Force people. And so they were building new Air Force bases and getting them staffed, and because they were looking forward to what was going to happen in late 43, 44, to where the big push was going to come along. So I think it all tied together.
Right. Now, before they shipped you overseas or off to Hawaii, did you get a chance to go home again?
No, not then. We went to California, Fairfield Suisun, picked up a B-24, a new one, which was kind of nice, and flew it to Hawaii. And I'm not sure exactly when that date was, but it must have been late in the spring of 43. But anyway, we then went to gunnery school in Hawaii, which was part of our further training to get ready to go down into the combat area.
Okay. Now, as a bombardier, did you get gunnery training, or was that just what other people did?
The bombardier is the armament officer
Okay.
in most B-24s. I didn't take that job too seriously because all the guys seemed to know pretty much what they were doing. But yeah, we would go out on a mission with our airplane and would strafe various locations. I think in Hawaii we went up to Kwajalein, which is kind of a deserted island, and shot the heck out of that. And I think we went down someplace off of Maui too. So we did that for probably a couple of months. We were stationed up at Kahuku, which is the north side of the island. One interesting little tidbit is that Dole had a pineapple plantation on one side of the Air Force Base, and the cannery was on the other side. So this train would pull through, and the base speed limit was 15 miles an hour. So we'd get somebody to hop on the plane and run the train coming in and would throw off pineapples. And I got to the point that I really couldn't face another pineapple after a little while. But they were good to start with.
Mm-hmm. All right. So about how long in total did you spend in Hawaii?
I would guess 2 or 3 months.
Okay. And this is sort of mid-44 by then?
No, it's, I wrote down some dates. Let me take a look at the sheet here. No, I say it's early 44.
Early 44, okay.
To March, and then I went down to Kwajalein.
All right. So now they're actually kind of sending you out into the theater now
Right.
for active duty.
The real world.
Okay. So are you able to fly from Hawaii to Kwajalein without a stop, or do you have to land
No,
somewhere?
we stopped at Johnson Island, which is, I haven't looked at the map recently, but I think it's about halfway
Right.
down there.
Right.
And the Kwajalein is in the Marshalls.
Okay. Physically describe Kwajalein. I mean, what does the place look like as you're trying to land there?
It's an atoll and a series of atolls that make a big circle. It's a big sandbar, really, but it was big enough to have a Air Force base on it, B-24s. I think the maximum height of the sandbar was probably 10 feet. And so the 11th Bomb Group, which is what the 98th Bomb Squadron was part of, had moved up to Kwajalein from Tarawa a few weeks before that. And so most of the people were experienced pilots that had been bombing various places.
Okay. Now, do you remember your first combat mission?
Yeah, not vividly, but I think the first few missions we would fly wing, even though my pilot was a major. But I'm pretty sure the mission was against Truk, which was a major Japanese bastion in a series of islands within a coral lagoon.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you're talking about flying wing. What does that mean?
Oh, we usually would fly against Truk as a squadron, and that'd be 12 airplanes, and there'd be four flights of 3 airplanes each, and there'd be the lead airplane, and he'd have 2 wingmen,
Mm-hmm.
and then there'd be another kind of leader up here with 2 wingmen, one down here with 2 wingmen, and so it was flying formation.
Mm-hmm.
Although these were long missions, they didn't fly in formation all the way, just when you got to the target. And until you got enough experience as a combat pilot, you usually flew wings.
Okay. Now, in the European theater, when squadrons or larger units would go in and bomb, normally just the squadron leader's plane would have the bombardier use the bomb site and everyone else just dropped the bombs when he did. Is that what you did, or were you actually getting to use an ordnance at that point?
No, we actually were individual bombardiers, and we would identify the targets and get all set up and so forth, and bomb the target even though we were in formation. Later on in the war, that European idea spread to the Pacific, and we ended up most of the bombardiers in the squadron, and I was squadron bombardier by then. That's a long story, but anyway, they would drop on me.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, was it harder to actually carry out the bombing mission against a real target than it had been when you were practicing that back in the States?
I guess the answer is yes, but I wasn't really conscious of that. I didn't really. I should have been more worried than I was, but I was still a kid, and it was still kind of a big adventure. And my claim to fame in the squadron, when I became squadron bombardier, was I was good enough to have very, very short bombing runs. And that means you weren't flying straight and level for much more than 20-25 seconds. And that was considered to be very thoughtful and very good.
Okay. Now, when you attacked a place like Truk, was there a lot of anti-aircraft fire?
Yeah, and there wasn't, this would be early 44, mm-hmm. and there wasn't a whole lot of fighter opposition.
Yeah.
There was some, and we would stage to Eniwetok in order to get to Truk, because the distances would go up to Eniwetok and get more fuel
right.
and so forth. And come back to Eniwetok and get fuel to get to Kwajalein. But anyway, the missions there were really digging up airfields mm-hmm. to neutralize their ability to fly off of those airfields. There was a few other things we did, but it was mostly airfield interdiction. Mm-hmm. And an airfield was pretty big, so you didn't have to be absolutely precise. There was one mission in Truk that was a kind of a radio station or something like that, on a very small island that had about a 1,500-foot runway, and we bombed that one time. And I think we dropped 1,000-pound bombs on that railroad station, on that radio station. Mm-hmm. Most of the bombs were 500-pounders.
All right.
And we'd carry 12 or 16 of them.
Okay. Now, would the attacks normally be just one squadron at a time, or would the whole group go together? Or?
Most of the attacks I was on were one squadron at a time. Okay. We also bombed Wake Island, which was even less than that. In fact, I think one time we bombed Wake Island just ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now,
it wasn't 1,000 plane raids like it was in Europe.
Right. Well, there wasn't a whole lot on Wake at that point. The Japanese didn't have aircraft there by then, and so it was just whatever the garrison was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, over Truk, then, did you encounter some fighter?
Yeah,
opposition?
And, once in a while we had escorts, not very often, but there were some P-38s in the area, and they had enough range to stay with us. Mm-hmm. But most of the time we were by ourselves, and yeah, there was a lot of flak, and by the time we were there, flak was a major danger, and that happened to our plane more than anything else.
Yeah. Now, were planes in the squadron getting shot down on these missions?
Not very often, but we get a lot of damage. In fact, my Purple Heart I was a bombardier getting close to the target, and a Japanese 20mm shell came into the bombardier compartment and went into the nose tire, before it exploded, or otherwise I probably wouldn't be here.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple of times, the northern bomb site would get obliterated by flak, and I'd be kneeling right behind it. So it was exciting at times, but I think we, over Truk, I don't think we lost, maybe one or two airplanes, but not a big number.
Okay.
And
Now,
in fact, the whole Central Pacific campaign was, and I was lucky to go there, was a lot easier than Europe.
right, certainly less fighter opposition and
Yep.
that kind of thing as you went. All right. Now, when you're using the northern bomb site, there is a point there when you're making the run where you actually control the plane, don't you?
It can be done that way. There was an automatic pilot
Mhm.
component to the northern bomb site. My pilot was pretty good though, and so sometimes he'd control the plane and follow the direction indicator in the cockpit, and sometimes I'd do it. But I think that he probably did a better job because he was also the leader of a formation and didn't want to disrupt the formation flying too much. And it didn't make any difference to me.
Okay. So you've got some variance here between what you did out in the Pacific and what they did over Germany.
Oh, a lot. They lost a lot more airplanes than we did too.
Right.
And whether Major Benish knew all that and picked the Pacific and was able to do that when he formed the crew or not, I'm just not sure. But if it wasn't, it was luck of the draw, and it was a good draw.
Now, how long did it take for your plane to become the lead plane in the squadron?
Oh, I think probably fifth or sixth mission. And if you did a good job, and I have a scrapbook still here, you got a commendation, not a commendation, you got a letter of congratulations from the colonel of the group. And I have probably half a dozen or more of those. Then you also got pictures of the bombing mission, and most of those were taken by the lead plane. So one of our gunners became chief photographer.
All right. And then when your plane becomes lead plane in the squadron, is that because the original squadron leader had flown enough missions to go on to something else, or the spot opened up, or did he actually leapfrog over somebody?
I don't really know, but you know, it was long about that time, you know, maybe the 10th or 15th mission, but he became squadron leader. Because he was a major,
Right.
and it was pretty unusual to have a fairly new pilot in the squadron to get promoted like that. But I'm sure the previous squadron leader, commander, must have gotten back to the States.
Mm-hmm. All right. What was life like on Kwajalein? I mean, it's not much of a piece of real estate.
Well, we'd fly about every third day, so it wasn't a case of having to fly every day.
Mm-hmm.
And in between times, it was very much a bachelor life, which I was used to, still being a kid. I played a lot of volleyball, went a lot of swimming. So it was really kind of a relaxed, interesting life, I thought. The only downside was you had to fly missions every third day, and you started getting, not the first couple of missions, but later on you became quite superstitious. You ate exactly the same things for those kind of breakfasts.
Mm-hmm.
When you took off, you sat exactly the same place in the airplane, and on the theory that it worked okay before, therefore it's going to work okay now. And it turned out that way, so it worked out pretty well. But it was, you know, some of the pilots were in their late 20s, and I think it was tougher on them than it was on me in terms of social arrangements. On Guam, we spent Guam was the next place I went to. We spent some of our time building an officers club. And it was a pretty nice officers club.
Okay. So about how long did you spend on Kwajalein, do you think?
I think it was from March or April until probably October of '44.
All right. And then while you were there, you launched attacks against Truk, against Wake. Did you make any raids against the Marianas, or were those too far away for you? So did
No.
you attack Guam or Saipan?
No, we didn't. And so I think by the time I left Kwajalein, I probably had maybe 20 missions. I'm not sure exactly how many.
Okay. Now they move you up to Guam. Now, how was Guam a different place to work than Kwajalein?
Well, it was much bigger. It was a real island. It's in the chain of the Marianas. Saipan's up to the north, and Tinian, and then Guam. Guam had been a previous U.S. possession occupied by the Japanese, but then won back by the Marines. And the airfield was probably a little bit longer, which was good. And I think it took off over kind of a cliff. So my pilot used to like to buzz the area between the takeoff point and the cliff, and that, I wasn't against that, but I thought that was kind of foolish. But anyway, it was exciting. And from Guam, we hit primarily Iwo Jima, and again, it was digging up airfields. We had one mission a couple of days before the Marines invaded, and we dropped incendiaries. And I'm not sure. I didn't know the invasion was coming, but it was incendiaries on the beach, and so it was a different kind of mission.
Right. Now, when you flew over Iwo Jima, did you encounter enemy fighters or just flak?
Again, mostly flak, but there was some fighters. And it was the 7th Air Force, I think, that was the only Air Force attacking Iwo Jima at the time. And as you know, from Guam to Japan, Iwo Jima is about exactly halfway. And it had 3 airfields. We had 2 constructed airfields, and they're considering constructing a 3rd. I don't think they ever got it finished. And if you want to see the pictures of that area, it's Mount Suribachi at one end and so forth.
Now, did you conduct bombing missions in support of the Marines after they landed, or were you pretty much done once they were ashore?
Once they were ashore, we stopped bombing because of who we might hit, and friendly fire and all that kind of thing.
Okay. And they land in February of '45. So at that point, what becomes your target? Did you fly against Okinawa, or did you fly against Japan? Or?
That's a mental block. I'm not really sure. I think we had some missions against. Is there a Palau over
Yes.
there? Yeah. Because I remember going to Palau once, and the invasion fleet was assembling, and it was a huge amount of aircraft carriers and battleships and stuff like that. So I think it was in the northern Philippines, and that's kind of close to it. So we bombed those areas. I don't think we bombed Okinawa, although I can't really remember.
Okay. Yeah, but it would have. Yeah, but you could have gone over and attacked targets in the Philippines and so forth at that point. All right. Now, what did you do when you were on Guam when you were off duty? So when you're not flying, what was there to do there?
Well, we could get on and swim, which we did. We could go into Agana, which wasn't much of a town, but we went to see it. I took an economics course, so I did some studying. In fact, I took 2 economics courses from some correspondence school, I'm not sure where. But I did get credit for them when I got back to Purdue. And I think it was more a question of counting missions and getting as close to 40 as you could and becoming superstitious and all those things. There wasn't a lot of social things going on. We did, for a couple of bottles of scotch, got a couple of truckloads of lumber, and started building an officers' club. So we spent time in the officers club because it was kind of nice. I think it was, and there was a hospital close by, so we'd have some nurses come by and so forth. And I was squadron bombardier, so I had a few things to do, clerical wise, but I don't believe that was a real big effort on my part.
Okay. Was there much turnover in the personnel in the squadron, or was it pretty much the same guys the whole way through?
Different people got 40 missions at different times, so they'd go home. We had a chance to go home. We had about 30 missions, so I had that chance. We would go up to the Hawaiian Islands on rest and recreation once in a while. I remember being over in Hawaii, in the Big Island for rest and recreation. I also remember being down on the beach in Waikiki and so forth.
When they got you to Hawaii, how did you get out there? Was it a transport plane or?
For rest and recreation?
Yeah.
There'd be planes going back to Hawaii periodically. In fact, one time we had a whole plane come back with a load of beer, which I thought was a great idea. But no, there'd be fairly frequent planes going back, and we just kind of hop on one of those.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't a highly structured environment. It was kind of a catch as catch can. My remembrance of it was kind of catch as catch can. I'm sure some of the bosses back in Hawaii were planning things in great detail, but it didn't seem to work out that way.
Okay. Now, within your air crew on the plane, was there much distinction between the officers and the enlisted men? Is there much effort to keep them separate at all?
Well, we lived separately. We had, in both cases, well, on Kwajalein we had a barracks, but in Guam we had a tent. And the officers' tents were in one area and the enlisted men tents were someplace else. But I think on the plane and on the missions it was very much camaraderie, and we each respected the other man's job and what he was doing. I got to be good friends with most enlisted men. When we got discharged, we were going to stick together and have reunions. Never did that. But I remember the engineer quite well. And my nickname was Junior, because I was young, or kid, and they respected my short bomb runs. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of a mutual respect. I can vaguely remember most of the names of the crew, but I have no idea where they are, if they're still alive or what.
Okay. You're talking about the short bomb run. Explain a little bit what the process is as you're heading toward a target and your squadron bombardier and so forth. Yeah. What do you do or what happens?
Well, before you get there, you do a 45 degree and you get the idea how much wind there is, because you can do that with the bomb sight. Mm-hmm. And you put all the data in for the size of the bomb and how high you're going to be when you drop the bomb and all that kind of thing. So you're ready and you're flying there at about 10,000 feet. You don't need oxygen. So you're getting everything prepared, and you're probably on a 10-hour mission. So when you get to be maybe half an hour from the target, you start climbing, and we usually bombed at 28, 29, 30,000 feet. And you had a selected IP, which is where you turn into the target, and you knew what the target was because of the briefing. Mm-hmm. And so as soon as you get to the IP that you wanted to use, you maneuver the plane into a gradual turn because you're in formation, pick up the target and start adjusting the bomb sight to coordinate speed and altitude and so forth. And so you have to be a certain point in space for that bomb to drop on a target from that airplane. And the problem is the flak gunners can work the equation backwards. Mm-hmm. And know exactly where you have to be. And so a lot of them, I think, just put up barrages of flak. But anyway, we'd get prepared to drop the bombs, and as we got closer to the target, we'd open the bomb bay doors, and the bombardier would do that. And then when one part of the bomb site met the other part of the bomb site, it would automatically release the bombs. And they had wires in them to keep a prop from spinning to arm the bomb, so the bomb wouldn't arm itself until it dropped out a couple hundred feet or so. And then you'd watch where they, you knew exactly how long it was going to take to get down to the surface. You'd watch what happened, but by then you're turning away and you're getting ready to go home.
So part of the advantage to a relatively short run is there's a more of a limited window there when the gunners on the ground can figure out where you're going to go and target that and just fill that chunk of the sky with metal. Yeah. Okay.
And that's kind of important.
Yeah, because with the really big formations that they used over Europe, that was a really serious
couldn't
problem.
do that. Yeah.
Now, let's see. So you've gotten. Once you get to Guam and so forth, you flew against Iwo Jima and so forth. Now, eventually, you switch away from Guam and go on to Okinawa, right?
Right.
Okay. And when do you do that?
It must have been late spring or early summer of '45. Taking Okinawa was a really big job and a very bloody affair.
Was that still going on when you got over there?
Yeah, we were at Yantan Airfield, and that was on Buckner Bay. General Buckner was killed there. But anyway, and they were still fighting up in the highlands. But we were fairly secure, except there was somehow an ammunition dump that got blown up fairly close to our airfield. I'm not sure whether that was a bomber from the Japan Air Force or whether it was sabotage or what, but anyway, it was a big excitement. Because it actually blew up for probably, I think like 12 hours or more.
Right. Because the ammunition has to cook off and get chain reactions of bombs going on.
And I don't think anybody got hurt, but anyway. And by then, most of my missions had been flown. I had one mission over Japan, so I was on Okinawa probably a couple of months. But I think it must have been from Guam. My co-pilot, Jake Lowe, was the first pilot on it with a new crew that was come down to the squadron, and he was shot down, and he ditched the airplane, and the Navy was supposed to pick him up, but they never found him. That was the one person we lost, and I knew his family pretty well, and it was kind of a heart-wrenching affair.
What was the closest call you had that you can recall?
Well, I mentioned the Japanese 20 millimeter coming in. A couple of bomb sites got shot out from in front of me. But then over one target, we had the hydraulic system shot out by, I think, must have been a fighter. We got back to our home base, which must have been Guam at the time. Couldn't get the landing gear down. You're supposed to be able to crank the landing gear down, but somebody had done that before and didn't recrank it, so we couldn't do that. So we had to land without wheels. And I guess that might have been Kwajalein, because we came in on a coral strip. But anyway, you come in, and the pilot was really good about it. Well, first of all, we threw everything out of the airplane we could, dropped the bow turret and so forth. And then we all assembled back in the waist, except the pilot and co-pilot, and got as secure as possible. And you come in and you skid for 1,500 yards, then you're worried about fire, so you get out of there as fast as you can. But it came in, didn't disturb any of the props. In fact, within a week they were flying that airplane, not on mission, but back to Hawaii and on the beer runs and so forth. So that was kind of an exciting period, but it turned out really quite harmlessly.
Okay. You said you flew one mission over Japan. Do you remember anything about that?
No, I was close to the end, and I was just hoping that something wouldn't happen.
Right.
And I'm pretty sure it was Kobe. And this would be about late July of 45. And I do remember on the briefing we were told, "Now stay away from Hiroshima.
Mm-hmm.
Don't even get close to bombing Hiroshima. Just leave it the way it is."
Mm-hmm.
And Kobe's right close there. But that's the only thing I remember about that mission. And then on the way home, on Okinawa, we had a tent to live in, but we had little bomb shelters. And a Japanese airplane, nighttime Charlie, came over dropping bombs, I guess. And I thought, son of a bitch, if I get killed tonight on a bomb run, it would really be, but it didn't happen. And so I got airplane transportation back to Hawaii. And while I was there at Hickam Field, they dropped the atomic bomb and ended the war. So I had a lot of medals and a lot of points and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So when I got back to Chicago, I got discharged in a hurry. They tried to persuade me into becoming part of the Air Force Reserve, and I refused that, and so forth. So in September of 45, I got home, discharged, married, and started back at Purdue all in one month, which is a pretty important month in my life.
Yeah. So you had been engaged the whole time you were in service then? Or?
When I came home on that previous leave that I mentioned,
Actually, I'm not sure that you did mention a previous leave.
When
When did you get leave?
It must have been about the time we moved up to Guam, or
Okay.
but I was home for a couple of weeks. My wife was going to Iowa University, and the train goes right through Iowa University to get to Chicago. So I stopped there and gave her a diamond ring, and so we weren't sure when we were going to get married, but we had kind of decided that.
Okay. But then you knew her before you went into the service then?
She and I she went to high school 1 year behind me,
Mm-hmm.
and we lived within 2 or 3 blocks of each other.
Okay. And how much did you communicate while you were overseas?
We wrote a lot of letters. It was a correspondence romance, and
Mm-hmm.
in hindsight, I didn't really know her all that well, because she had changed at Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
I had changed in the Air Force. I did go through the formality of asking her parents if it was okay and if I had permission, and all the things you used to do that you don't do anymore. But I tried to do things the way they should be done. That seemed like pretty good sense.
All right. Now, while you were in places like Guam or Okinawa, did they have things like USO shows going through or other?
I don't remember any of those
like
at all, and I'm sure there weren't any on Kwajalein.
Mm-hmm.
There's enough people on Guam they could have, but I don't remember ever going to any of those. So I don't think so.
Okay. When you were on Guam or in Okinawa, did you ever see anything of the local population there?
Yeah, on Guam particularly, our squadron shower was a couple of 55-gallon drums on top of some 2x4s, and the sun would warm the water up, and we'd go out there taking showers. There was no privacy. Chimaros would wander down the road not too far away, and we'd wave at them, and they'd wave at us. And it was kind of almost humorous.
But the Chimaros are basically friendly on Guam. They didn't like the Japanese very much.
Right, and on Okinawa, of course, is quite different. I wasn't there very long, so I'm not sure how that all turned out.
Because that had been part of Japan for a very long time.
Right,
so
yeah.
that was a different kind of situation.
It still is.
Yeah. All right. Are there other particular incidents or things that kind of stand out in your memory from the time that you're spent overseas on these different places?
Well, not much to talk about, but I think I did mature a lot. And I think when I got back to Purdue, I was quite a lot better student, and all those sort of things. So there were some positive things about the war, despite all the other traumas and so forth. So I came out of the Army, Air Force, kind of neutral. I wasn't a great lover of them, but I didn't resent or object to too much what was going on. I never had the big affairs like they had in Europe with the major losses and all your buddies getting shot down and so forth. I think that our squadron only had, my co-pilot was shot down when he was the first pilot, and there was one or two other losses in a year and a half, which was really fairly easy.
Right. Okay. Now, once you did get back, you go back to Purdue. What were you studying there?
I wasn't sure, except I had gotten a science award in high school graduation, so I thought I was a scientist and so I looked at Purdue, and it's a good engineering school. I was interested in chemical engineering, so I think about after I'd been back there for 6 months or so, I think I enrolled in a chemical engineering school, and that turned out to be a good choice for me. My wife was had 2 years at Iowa, and so she enrolled in first home ec, but then she changed to chemistry, and finally pharmacy, and then she got pregnant, didn't graduate, and so forth. But I was quite happy with chemical engineering, and I think it was a good school. And Dr. Shree was the head of the school at the time. He was a character all by himself. But when I was a graduate student, I worked for him. I got to know him pretty well.
So did you just go straight into graduate school from undergraduate and just keep going?
Right. I went around the clock, and so I started. I was still a freshman when I got back there. I graduated in February of '48, and then stayed on for an extra year to get a master's degree. I knew it would have been better to change school to get a different environment, different so forth. But I was married, and we had a child by the time, and I was kind of broke, and so there were a lot of reasons for sticking around and also getting through as quickly as I could.
Okay, and then what kind of job did you get then once you got out?
I was at an ACS meeting in Chicago at one time, and Harold Garman, whose name I gave you, and so forth, and he was down there. He was a year ahead of me, and he said that he worked for the Upjohn Company, and he said it's a great place to work. You ought to apply there, blah blah blah. And so he convinced me I should, and I think I had 5 job offers and one of them was Upjohn. Jobs were easy to get back in those days. They really needed a lot of chemical engineers, and I got into Upjohn at a very good time because there was a few people there that were there throughout the war, but they needed a lot of new people too, and so that all worked out really quite well, and I've been here ever since.
All right. Okay then. Well, it makes for a good story, so thank you very much for taking the time to tell it to me today.
I worked at Upjohn as a chemical engineer, and then I helped build the progesterone plant, which was a chemical plant, and then I had a variety of jobs, but in in early '61 I transferred to international, and I had charge of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, so I was a big job. I always lived here in Kalamazoo, but I took a lot of airplane rides, and then later on I headed up the chemical division because I was a chemical engineer and had quite a few years experience by then. And so I had a good job for quite a little while. And then, I don't know if you're interested, but I did do a curricula vitae for some other job, and you can have that if you want.
That'll be useful. All right. Well, I I think that probably takes
Okay.
care of this. All right. Thank
So
you.
how we doing time-wise? Okay, oh yeah, right on time.
Just shy of an hour.